morning. It's good to see y'all this morning. If you would be taking your Bibles and turning with me to Acts chapter 21. Acts chapter 21. As we continue walking through the book of Acts, we're nearing the end of our journey. This morning we're going to look at chapter 21. We'll start in about verse 20 and go down through about 11 to 23. Sounds like a lot of verses. We're not going to look at every single verse. We're going to move through it fairly quickly. That's not, remember, they had a discussion about this earlier on, and they basically told the Gentiles that in order to become a Christian, they didn't have to become a Jew. Well, here, people are basically saying, Paul is telling the Jews they ought to become Gentiles. And so stop circumcising your children, stop obeying the traditions that they have as Jews. And to be fair, it's not entirely false. It is false. They're over-exaggerating what Paul is saying. They're taking his words and they're twisting them around. But he's not telling anybody to stop being a Jew. What he's telling them is circumcision really doesn't matter anymore. In fact, that's exactly what he says. He says in order to be a child of God, or in order to be a part of the people of God, circumcision is of no consequence. And so they really don't like that. They don't like the idea that their traditions are not important enough to be a part of the process of becoming a believer, a part of the people of God. They do not like that at all. And so, in their minds, he might as well be telling them to stop being Jews. And so they're upset, they're frustrated with Paul. And so James says, listen, I'm worried, man, I don't know what we're going to do. They're going to hear that you've shown up. They're going to hear that you're in town. And when they hear that you're in town, brother, there is going to be a fight over you and your teaching. You see, I don't think James is being mean. I don't think he's being dismissive. I think he truly is worried about the church in Jerusalem. He's worried about this fight that seems to be happening, whether he likes it or not. He's afraid Paul's going to cause this huge conflict in the Jerusalem church. He's going to destroy the unity. And so he's truly seeking a way to find peace between Paul and the rest of the Jews. He's trying to figure out a way to where they can meet in the middle and there won't be this huge uproar. Now, if you've ever been stuck between two people who don't see eye to eye, you know how challenging this is going to be, right? I know if you've ever gone to eat and you're driving and you're deciding where to eat, in my vehicle, if it's me and Crystal and then Josiah and Zoe, I often make the mistake of saying, hey kids, where would y'all like to eat? Y'all ever done that? And every time Crystal's like, John, you shouldn't have done that. Because Josiah's going to say, pizza, pizza, pizza. Like that's all he's going to say. And so he's going to be like, well, what about salad? What about burgers? What about this over here? She wants something different. And so they're just going to go back and forth. And I've created a fight. Now, in order to fix this, sometimes I will pull the dad card. Hey, y'all don't get to decide. Mom, where do you want to go, right? And so you can just put up with it. And they will put up with it. There may be some weeping and gnashing of teeth, but it'll be settled. Here's the problem. It doesn't work that way with adults. They have a much harder time moving past disagreements than children do very often. And so James just can't stand up and be like, hey, y'all cut it out. He can say that, but it's not really going to change things. And so he's trying to figure out a compromise, a way to fix things. And so, when the kids start going back and forth, I always have an ace up my sleeve. I'll say, hey, let's just go to Chick-fil-A. And then all of a sudden, everyone is happy, unless it's on Sunday. I do that on occasion too. That's kind of funny, by the way. But hey, they're closed. Sorry. But anyway, there's just something about Chick-fil-A that brings peace and unity into the vehicle. Everyone likes Chick-fil-A. I don't know. Maybe God truly has blessed them. I don't know. There's just something about Christian chicken that brings people together. And so I think that's what James is trying to do here. He's trying to figure out a way to offer a peace offering so that, there'll be a smile and it's my pleasure all around for everyone to understand, we're just going to get along and it's going to be wonderful. It's going to be great. And so he offers to Paul a plan of action to silence his critics. Look at verse 23. He says, here's what we're going to do, Paul. You do this and I think we'll fix the situation. And at verse 23, he says, do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Just saying that's biblical, by the way. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. So James says, Paul, here's what we're going to do. We have these guys over here. They had a Nazirite vow of some sort that they had agreed to. They had decided to go through a period, it's usually a 30-day period of abstaining from certain foods and drinks and not cutting their hair, at the end of which there'd be a purification rite and there would be a shaving of the head. And so this is what James offers. He says, hey, go through this process with them and everyone will know that it's all a lie. It's all a big misunderstanding. You actually are for the Jews. You're not against us. You actually have not forgotten about the Jews. You haven't just completely gone Gentile or whatever, but you actually care about us as well. Do this and everyone will know that you truly care. And so, look at verse 25. He says, but as for the Gentiles who have believed, we've sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and from blood and from what has been strangling and from sexual immorality. In other words, James is saying, this has nothing to do with the Gentiles. I'm just trying to keep peace here in Jerusalem. This doesn't change the gospel at all. I just want people to see that you are not against us. And so in verse 26, what we see here is a man who loves Jesus more than his own pride. A man who's humbly willing to do whatever it takes for people to hear the gospel. Look at verse 26. Then Paul took them in, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled and the offering presented for each one of them. So Paul went and paid for the offering and for these men's heads to be shaved. So I want you to think about this. Paul submits to James, and he says, okay, James, let's give it a shot, man. Like, his response should teach us something here. He doesn't get defensive with James. Paul the apostle, who's been taught personally by Jesus, like last week we saw like his do-rags were being touched by people and people were being healed. It's not like he's low man on the totem pole around here. Like God has used him mightily. Like he's responsible for countless thousands of people coming to faith in Jesus. There's no telling how many churches he's been a part of planting. There's no telling how much he's suffered for the sake of the gospel. In fact, he's in Jerusalem just because he loves the Jewish people so much. He wants them to hear of Jesus. And so he doesn't get all up in his feelings or whatever. He doesn't spend hours debating with James whether or not this is a good idea. He doesn't try to point out, well, this isn't really necessary under the new covenant, man. Like this isn't, I really need to give you some information on this. He doesn't do that. He just says, okay, I'll do it. Why does he say that? Well, because this is the way Paul operates. 2 Corinthians 9 tells us how Paul operates. He tells us that those who are under the law, he became as under the law. Those who are not under the law, he became as those not under the law. And his basic point was this: as long as it didn't affect the gospel, as long as it didn't go contrary to God's word, he says, I became all things to all people that I might by all means save some. In other words, he was willing to do whatever it took as long as it did not cause him to disobey God, so that other people could hear the gospel. We can learn from Paul's example here. There's a flexibility on things that don't matter and a rigidity on things that do. Like gospel matters, no compromise with Paul. There's not going to be a compromise there. Things that don't have anything necessarily to do with the gospel, whatever you want to do, let's keep the peace. Let's try to not cause a fight over something that doesn't matter. And so this is what Paul's about. It's not that he's afraid of people or a pushover, as we'll see here in a minute. It's that he truly does not want to be the reason someone does not hear about Christ. He does not want his preferences, his ideas, his way of life. He does not want those things to be the reason other people do not hear about Jesus. Guys, we can learn from both groups here. We can learn from the Jewish people and the way that they were called on to give up aspects of their culture and move on past the way that they'd been raised. And we can also learn from the Gentiles and the way they were called to do everything they could to not offend the Jews and not cause problems where there shouldn't be any problems. It's the idea that we truly allow matters that don't matter to slide, that just don't make an issue of something that does not matter. Now, that's the approach they take. It doesn't mean that it works. Unfortunately, they do not have a Chick-fil-A. They have a complete blow up in the town of Jerusalem. I mean, it gets crazy. We won't read the verses, but in 27 through 31, what we see happening is Paul does go into the temple, but then people show up and they begin to lie and they begin to say that he's taking Gentiles into the temple even though he wasn't, and all these different things. And this huge mob forms. And this mob forms and begins to beat Paul because they want to beat him to death. They want to destroy him. They cannot stand Paul. All he's trying to do is keep the peace, and what he gets for his labor is a beat down by a mob. Like that's all he ends up with. Like he tries his best. He tries his best to bring everybody together, but instead he just gets beaten up yet again. And so the leader of the soldiers in this area, the Roman leader of the town, sends in some soldiers to rescue him because he's trying to figure out what's going on. Look at verse 32. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune, that's the leader guy, and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. And so they're punching Paul, and they look up, oh, soldiers coming, let's go the other way. And so then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him!" And so, basically, if the Roman soldiers had not stepped in to protect Paul, these Jews would have beat him to death right there on the spot. I want you to think about evoking in people that strong of a response. Like wherever he goes, this is what happens with him. He's trying to do the right thing, he still gets beat up. I mean, so do you think it's worth it? I mean, at the end of the day, what Paul did, was it worth it? He bent over backwards for these people over and over again, and they just keep trying to kill him. I mean, what's the point? Shouldn't he be done with them? But then look at verse 37. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek?" Verse 38, "Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins into the wilderness?" Now, you just have to understand how hilarious this is in a lot of ways. I want you to think about this. And so when this guy hears Paul speak not Egyptian but Greek, his first thought is, oh, you're the guy in charge of the 4,000 assassins. You're that guy. Like when he looked at Paul, he assumed this guy was part of an elite fighting force. Like, I just want you to process that for a minute. This dude assumed that Paul was a part of a group of assassins. So, he's not a weak guy is what I'm getting at here. I don't know if he looked and he saw these people beating on him and he's still able to stand. He's like, that guy is one tough cookie right there. I don't know. But apparently, this man's first response is to assume that Paul is a military man, to assume that Paul is a fighter. So Paul, standing there beaten and bloody, says, "Hey man, can I talk to you for a sec? I need to ask you something." Look at verse 39. Paul replied, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And so he says, "No, I'm not an Egyptian. I'm actually a Jew from Tarsus, and I want to talk to the people." And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, and so I want you to think about this for a second. So Paul has been beaten. Like their intentions were to beat him to death. So they're not holding back. The soldiers rescue him. Before he gets taken into the soldiers' quarters, he says, "Hey, can I ask you for a favor?" And this guy's like, "Sure, whatever you want, man." And he's like, "I want to talk to those people." So he's like, "Y'all quiet down, I got something I need to say." And he begins to preach to them. I don't know about y'all, but if I get beaten by a mob and drug out of there, I'm not exactly sure I'm in a preaching mood. I may have some things I want to say, but they're probably not sermon, right? I mean, let's be honest, before you judge me, you know I'm telling the truth. You'd want to tell those people what you actually thought. If you got an opportunity, especially if you're standing up on the tower away from them all. You can finally tell them what you think. But no, Paul in his humility and in his love for these people, he begins to preach to them. Look at verse 1 of chapter 22. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. You notice he says brothers and fathers. He opens up with a statement of respect and admiration for them. He's teaching us the attitude and mindset of someone who truly wants people to come to faith in the gospel. He's willing to swallow his pride. He's willing to forego a chance to tell people how much he's been wronged by them. He's willing to forego a chance to criticize them, all because he believes that these people need Jesus more than he needs to have his rights honored. And so from here, he simply begins to preach to them, and he begins to share his testimony with them. And as he does, he doesn't talk about how awesome he is. He talks to them about how amazing the gospel is and how amazing Christ is and how because of Christ, he's a changed man. He talks about how he murdered Christians for the sake of Judaism, just like they were about to try to do to him. He's saying, I've been there. Listen to verses 3 through 5. He says, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus in Sicilia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way, speaking of Christianity, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. As a high priest, and the whole council of the elders can bear me witness. Hear what he's saying. He's saying, listen, your own leaders can tell you that, yeah, I was this guy. Like, this is what I did. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those who also were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. He's like, listen, guys, I was in the same situation you were in. I totally get where you're coming from. He's seeking a sort of a commonality between them so that they understand where he came from. And he's like, I was you, but then I met Jesus. Skip down to verse 8. He says, and I answered. So Jesus, of course, on the road to Damascus, Jesus knocks him down, blinds him. And he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Look at verse 8, and this is Jesus' response. And I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. And so Paul, on his way to Damascus, on his way to kill Christians, Jesus meets him, and he changes him forever because Paul learns, oh wait, Jesus is my Lord. And so Jesus tells him to go on into Damascus for further instructions. And so verse 12, and when Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by the Jews who lived there, came to me and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. And so Paul meets with Jesus, and when he meets with Jesus, Jesus changes him. He changes everything about him. He changes what Paul's about. He changes everything. He washes away his sins. Now, our meeting with Jesus, if you've met with Jesus, may not have been as dramatic as Paul's, but it's no less important. Like, every one of us had the same experience, as in we were dead in our sins and trespasses, and when we met Christ, he made us alive together with him. Like, we really are all in the same boat. The message of the gospel is not that some people are better than others or some people are worth more than others. The message of the gospel is that we are all lost and undone and have no hope without Christ. Like, if you're here this morning and you think, oh, well, I'm better or worth more than those people over there because I had this upbringing and God's lucky to have me, you're wrong. The only reason you have salvation is because Jesus died in your place. The same price for your salvation is the price for every other person who's ever been saved, salvation. If you're here this morning, you're like, I'm worth less than those people over there. You're wrong. You're worth just as much as a person who did everything right from the time they were little, which we know that doesn't ever happen. So it doesn't matter. Paul's getting at, guys, I was where you are, but because of Christ, I have been redeemed. I've been made new. Look at verse 17. When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. Verse 19. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another, I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. Paul says, God, you may have forgiven me, but I bet you they ain't. They know who I was. They know all the horrible things I did. He doesn't hide who he was. And he makes it clear he's just as guilty as the next person. He never gets over this. But Jesus changes him from the inside out. And listen to the call that Jesus gives to Paul in 21. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And so this is Paul's mission. This is why he goes to the Gentiles. And look at verse 22. Up to this word, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. That is one tough crowd, isn't it? Like, how would you like for somebody to say, hey man, how'd your sermon go yesterday? And did you have any decisions? And you'd be like, yeah, they all decided I should die. Like, that'd be a fun Monday morning, wouldn't it? But I mean, that's what Paul goes through here. When they hear that he's going to the Gentiles, they cannot stand it anymore. They could not handle the idea that God's people would be made up of people not like them. And so from here, he's put on trial. The Roman tribune continues to try to figure out and get to the bottom of it. And so he brings him in front of the Sanhedrin. Look at verse 1 of chapter 23. And looking intently at the council. And so the council is the Sanhedrin. This is the Jewish religious leaders. This is the Sadducees and the Pharisees. These are the people that Paul's speaking to. He's on trial in front of them, giving a defense. He says, and looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. This murderer, this man who had killed Christians, says, I'm standing in front of you with a clear conscience. There's a lesson here that we really need to hear this morning. Paul was not driven by guilt. He was driven by grace. He was not trying to earn God's favor. He was not trying to make up for what he had done and somehow win back God's approval. He already had it, and it just blew him away. We're not driven by guilt. We're driven by grace, guys. When Paul says he's the chief of sinners, he's not wallowing in guilt and shame. He is proclaiming the fact that God's love is greater than our greatest of sins. And because of that forgiveness, he has freedom. And so he's not walking around in this form of guiltiness and he's doing everything out of guilt. No, he actually is living in grace. He is serving others in grace because that's what he has been shown. And that's what he wants to show others. He remembers who he was, but now he knows who he is. And so in spite of all that he had done, God is using him and continues to use him even now. Like earlier when he's saying, but you don't know who I was. God's like, yeah, I do know who you were. He didn't allow who Paul was to keep him from being who God had called him to be. The same is true for us. And so we don't really have time to get into it, but the response here is for Paul to get slapped across the face. He hadn't really said anything that seems like he should get slapped across the face. And Paul's response is, you're a hypocrite. God's going to get you. You whitewash wall. He feels bad about it after the fact because he finds out he's a high priest. And so he's standing there, and as he's standing there, trying to gather his thoughts, look at verse 6. Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. So Paul ain't no dummy. He looks up and he sees Sadducees and Pharisees. Sadducees were the theological liberals of their day. And so Sadducees, they didn't really believe in the supernatural very much. They believed in a few things, but mostly they were functional atheists in a lot of ways. Like they didn't believe, and they certainly didn't believe in the resurrection. That's why they were sad, you see, right? I mean, y'all know that one. So that's why they were sad, you see, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. They had no hope for the future. But the Pharisees did, and it was a big deal to them. And Paul sees these two groups. He's like, guys, here's why I'm on trial. It has to do with the resurrection. And all of a sudden, Paul is no longer the focus. The disagreement between these two groups are the focus, and so they begin to go at each other. So much so that the Roman tribune has to interrupt and break in and steal Paul out because he's afraid they're going to rip him in half. Like, can you just, I just imagine, these uppity religious leaders, and the robes and all their medals and everything, throwing chairs at each other like they're in WWE or something. That's kind of what's going on here over this disruption over the resurrection. Now, what Paul said did help him in the moment, but he wasn't lying. Guys, the truth this morning is the resurrection is the point. Like he really is right. He's not exaggerating. The reason why Paul is on trial is because of the resurrection. Because you see, if Jesus rose from the dead, then he really is who he said he is. And everything he said is really true, and we actually are called to obey him and follow him. And Judaism is no longer the way, but the way of Christ is the way. It changes everything about everything, But if he did not rise from the dead, then the truths that he spoke are not true. Now we know that he did rise from the dead. And that's Paul's point. Jesus is alive, and since he is alive, I can do nothing but obey. And y'all's problem, the reason you don't like me, is because you don't understand and you don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. He's like, that's our issue. That's our beef. If you understood that Jesus rose from the dead, you'd be on my side. And so everything, guys, comes back to this. In fact, that's what he says in 1 Corinthians 15. Without the resurrection, we have no hope. What are we doing? Let's eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die. But the resurrection gives us hope for the future, gives us a reason to live, gives us a purpose and a way to share. And so Paul says, guys, Jesus is alive. That's why I'm in front of you today. And so this guy takes him out and takes him back to his cell. I want you to think about something. Paul has went to Jerusalem to give a missionary report, but also to win the Jews to Christ. He gets there. He's told, hey, if you do this, you'll bring peace and unity to the church rather than destroying the church, and you can share the gospel. He tries that. Doesn't work. He gets beat up for his efforts. He then again tries, after he gets beat up, to share the gospel. Again, doesn't work. He gets an audience with the religious leaders, and he shares again the point and what he's actually about. And again, it doesn't work. How many converts did he have here? It doesn't look like any. Can you imagine how frustrating and depressing this would be? You got to understand, Jerusalem's the center of Judaism. It's the place where Paul's people are from. It's the place, the center of the people where he says in Romans that if he could, he would go to hell for them if they could become Christians. Like, that's how much he loves these people. And he wants to see them come to Christ. He's done everything he can to make that happen, and it has not happened. I imagine I would feel like a failure. Look at verse 11, and we'll finish up. Here in verse 11, we see that Jesus understands what Paul's going through. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you also must testify in Rome." And so Jesus comes to Paul and he comforts him. He reminds him of a few things. He reminds us this morning that he knows where we are. Like, if you are just in a slump and it seems like no matter what you try, you can't get out of where you are. He knows where you are. He doesn't have to look for Paul. He knows exactly where Paul is. He knows exactly what he's going through. He's promised us that he will be with us even to the end of the age. And so whatever you're going through this morning, know he knows where you are and he is with you. Secondly, they cannot take from you the grace he has given you and the story of the grace he has given you. Doesn't matter, these people have lied about Paul, they've tried to hurt him in every way, but they cannot take from him the old story, the gospel story of what God has done in his heart and in his life. And so he has stood up and he has shared. You notice what Jesus says here. It says, you have testified to the facts about me. Paul, you did what you were supposed to do. You did not fail. You are a magnificent success. Remember, guys, our job is not to save people. Our job is to share the gospel. And so as Paul's sitting there maybe thinking, I have failed utterly and completely, the truth is, he did what God called him to do, and the rest is really up to God. And these people who have rejected him, it's not up to Paul. He can't do anything about that. And so what Jesus is basically saying to Paul is, well done. You did what you were supposed to do. And maybe you need to hear that this morning. Guys, things outside of your control are outside of your control. Represent the gospel. Preach the gospel to the people you come in contact with. That's what he's called you to do. And then finally, he's not finished with you. He says, so you must testify also in Rome. He's saying to Paul, you're going to Rome because you still have work to do. You're going to Rome because I am not finished with you. What you need to hear this morning is if you are breathing, he is not done with you. He has purpose yet for you. He tells us in Ephesians 2, he says that before the foundation of the world, like God made and he planned out works for those who would believe on Christ. If you're here this morning and you've trusted on Christ, he has stuff for you to do. As long as you are breathing, he has purpose for you. And he calls you to fulfill that purpose, to serve him. You have purpose this morning. You are not going anywhere until he's done with you. So you may as well get about the purpose he's called you to be about. Don't get discouraged. Understand your job. Your job is to preach the gospel. Your job is to share the story of grace the best you can and leave the rest up to him. And if you have not put your faith in him, you have not trusted in him this morning, I would invite you to do just that. Because guys, he really is alive. And he promises that whoever puts their faith in Jesus will live forever with him. If you would pray with me as we get ready for a time of invitation. Father, I thank you. I thank you for your word. God, I thank you for the gospel. I thank you, God, for people in our lives and people in the word like Paul. People who served you faithfully, people who just give us an example of what it looks like, God, to do whatever it takes to get the gospel out. Lord, I pray that you would give us the courage to do that. God, that you would give us the passion to do just that, Lord, that you would put people in our lives this week that we can share with, that you would give them open hearts and ears to hear the gospel. And Lord, I pray for those who don't know you this morning. I pray that you'd make the gospel real to them, that they'd see the truthfulness of it, and that they would come to faith in Jesus Christ. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. If you would stand with us, and as we stand, would you come if God's working in your heart this morning?